Hello, Keith.
Oh
How's that?
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
solid.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you have this like, it's almost raspy, kind of like a gravelly element to your voice, and these mics pick up on tones like that really well. So I just wanted to get in
Oh,
there.
nice.
I wanted to get in there and get.
I want to get in there and get that done.
All right. All right, we're going to take a little break here. I want to tell you about something pretty amazing that we stumbled upon. A little ways back, we interviewed this amazing dude, Kwame Bowen, and he shared with me after the episode that his mother is a poet. And what's awesome about that is that he has all of her writings and all her poems, but what he doesn't have is her reading them. That inspired Keith and I to then start recording videos for our daughters.
And as we started recording those videos, we started running into the challenges of where are we going to send them to our daughters? How are we going to get them to them? Where are we going to save them? Is it going to be Google Drive? Is it going to be OneDrive? And then along came GiftPod. It's an audio memory that you can record and give as a private podcast. What they're going to do is edit, add music, and produce the audio that you provide them into a professional podcast that you can share with your family members for any purpose. We use it for our daughters in the future.
All right, so check it out. In the write-up for this podcast, you're going to see a link to GiftPod. If you use promo code MIC10, you're going to get a discount. And leave some amazing memories for your friends, family, loved ones, maybe for yourself. Why don't you time capsule this for yourself? I don't know.
So check them out.
giveagiftpod.com.
MIC10 promo.
Welcome back to the More in Common podcast. I am your co-host Keith with my man Ron, and today we are with Josh Adam. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Right on. Glad to be here. This is exciting.
Glad to have you. So Josh is a Navy veteran. He's married with 4 children, including twins. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in history and Christian education from Seattle Pacific back in 2000. He did his post-bachelor's research at, I might get this right, Katholieke Universiteit-Leuven in Belgium.
Pretty solid.
Nice, I tried.
Nice.
And then received his master's in sports and exercise science from Minnesota. He rowed for 4 years at Seattle Pacific and started coaching rowing in 2001, which has led to an amazing career in coaching. He has coached at Seattle Pacific, Indiana, Washington State, the U.S. national team, and now is the head coach at USC. And we are excited to have you, my man.
Yes, we are.
That's solid. Thanks.
Yeah, I get a good one. Did I make any mistakes there?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that hits the highlights.
Good. So you have a degree in history and Christian education.
Yeah, true story.
Very curious. Given the fact, by the time this comes out, it'll probably be December timeframe where our audience is watching or listening to this. But today is the Friday before Election Day. And I'm curious how your degree, especially in history, because I love history. I'm fascinated by it. And you marry that to the religious component, how it paints your perspective of the current political climate.
Wow. Yeah, that gets right into it. So the degree that I have, like the area of history that I really focused in on was probably like medieval to late medieval history of the Iberian Peninsula, and specifically like church history, like history of the entire Western church, I guess you could say. I had some really great professors that like had really honed in on like what had happened in Spain, and then subsequently like with the move over to South America and like how all of those things kind of played together. And the Christian education side was a combination of human development as well as how do you train faith in someone. So, I mean, it was a great balance in terms of looking at where we have been in the history of the Western Church, as well as like, okay, how do you instill and bring up faith in someone else? So how that would inform where we are currently is, I think that there's almost a tension right now, like especially in the US. But I would say if you wanted to expand that outside the United States, like you can kind of sense it worldwide,
Easily.
where there's some deep sense of nationalistic tendencies, and some of that positive and some of that negative. And I think some of that is informed by people's faith, and some of that I think is being informed in contrast to some very fundamental values that some people hold. And people are polarizing ideas rather than trying to find common ground, right? Like to find space where they can actually communicate. And they're looking at historical actions, whether it's recent history, last 4 years of a political candidate, or last 20 years of something that's happened inside of a church or inside of what's happening, as a reason for why they're going to polarize their feelings and their thoughts. And I don't know that that's necessarily the best way to use history to inform, to kind of like entrench yourself into a decision. Like for me, history was always the story. I loved history for that standpoint, to kind of unpack what the story was of like how something had occurred. And it always softened my opinions rather than hardened my opinions. So I think where we find ourselves now is like people using a selected narrative, and everybody would say like, oh, everybody selects the narrative of the story of the history that they're going to look at. But I think because of that, it should soften our ideas and our ideals and open up more of a conversation, because the way that you interpret your history is going to be different than mine. And the only way that we're going to figure out that distance is through communication, right? So like I think that what it does for me now is it forces me into a dialogue. That forces is not the right word. It encourages me to open up a space where I have to ask the question. That there's one of my favorite philosophers is Martin Buber, and he has a great book. He's got a lot of them, but like one of my favorites is I and Thou, where he really talks about the space of like, what does it mean to be an I, and what does it mean to be like an it and a you. And he's got this great statement, like in an I, that's what I know about, right? Like I have thoughts, I have experiences, I have feelings, like I can talk intelligently about I. If I have an it, right, like the cup, like that's sitting on the table, like I can experience it, but it doesn't experience me. Like it doesn't come back. So there's an I-it relationship. You is totally different, right? Like you're another I, right? You're having your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations, you're having a response to that. And really the only way to bridge that distance between I and you is communication, is dialogue. And so like, I think that's where my experience of history kind of comes through, is like I love understanding the story. And so it's opened up this space for me where I'm always trying to figure out, okay, how do I bridge that distance between I and thou, or I and you?
In that, so earlier you kind of talked about one of the things that drives you, keeps you going, is your faith. And then you talked about learning about instilling faith, or like the concept, like how would you help instill faith? What is faith to you? Like how would you define faith, and what is it for you?
So I think, there's several layers to that, right? Like faith as an overarching term, I think people talk about faith in themselves. It's like, that's one idea, right? So like, I think one concept is like, I have a good idea of who I am, and I have like a confidence or a faith that like, I know what I'm doing. I think that's one element. I think that there's like, there's a lot of conversation right now, I think, around faith in humanity. Having
or
like, lack thereof, right? Like, so you have like a faith in like that there's a genuine good that might be there, or faith that like there's none, right? Like that there's, you have like almost like a dystopic idea.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't really have faith in that. I think a lot of times like faith triggers a thought with people that, you know, it's faith in like a certain tenet of like a religious idea. Like I have a faith that's driven by Islamic tenets, or I have a faith that's driven by, you know, Western Catholicism, or I have faith that's like Orthodox, or I have faith that's like Jewish. You know, I think that there's a number of things that come there, but at its root, like faith is having like a hope in evidence of things that are unseen.
Yeah.
And like that struggle to find evidence in something that's like tangible, intangible, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't really put your finger on it. But that for me is kind of like my definition of where faith would be.
I ask because I think a lot of people hear faith and they ascribe it immediately to religion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no. Like you have faith every time you get in your car or you get in a plane. Like you have faith that that thing's going to get where it's supposed to go. Like that's just the belief in something.
Yeah,
you
faith
can't
in
see.
science, right?
Faith in
Like,
science. Yeah.
What is the evidence of the unseen that you experience? Like, what is that? You've put a lot of time and energy into that. I have some, like, I'm very curious to get your take if that question even makes sense.
Yeah. So if we would have a definition of faith as hope in evidence of things that are unseen,
Mm-hmm.
then I think we all have some sort of experience of an intangible or something that is other, like vertical versus horizontal, right? Like I have faith that Rodney's going to continue to sit in that chair for, you know, maybe for the next hour or something, right? Like that would be like a horizontal element of faith. But I think
don't trust them that much. It might...
You never know. That water looks good.
But I think that if you really would to push somebody, all of us have had some sort of experience of the ethereal or the nebulous or the other, or religious, would some people say. But I don't think religious is the right term, because religious is like at its root, it's like you're disciplined about something. Like if you really dive into the definition of it, but it's almost like the mystery, right? Something strange or something that I can't explain happened.
Unexplainable. Yeah.
Right. And some of that gets explained inside of, you know, like a religious structure. Some of that gets explained inside of, you know, the X-Files, you know, like, you know, aliens or something along those lines. Everybody's got this. So I think that evidence of something unseen is, what is your experience of the intangible other, right? And so you have hope in that. Some people feel like, okay, there's a guiding element that's helping me through this life. You know, there's, you know, some people will ascribe God to that. You know, some people will ascribe it like an experience of like a group of people. I remember having like an old guy that was in Alcoholics Anonymous say, like, for me, God is group of drunks, right? And inside of that element was like the evidence of something greater. Like here's like a group of people that are coming together with a common cause of trying to be better humans, and that energy that they all had together was the thing that kept them coming back and working on their sobriety and working on being better. So for me, that evidence of things unseen is, you know, it's different for everybody, like in what that is. And sometimes there's common elements.
It's interesting as I think to your sentiments of today's political climate, and everybody seems to be informed by some faith, and they are holding it in contrast to others. So whether it's faith in conspiracies, or it's faith in religious doctrine, or if it's whatever that faith is, there's this ever existing evidence that seems to be just bombarding people through online media or whatever the case, that fortifies that faith rather than creating a space for connection to learn more about where other people's faith is coming from. creating this divide. And you said something like this space to ask questions. I mean, you've thought about this a lot. How do you create that space for yourself so that when someone expresses something that may be counter to the evidence that you've experienced in your unseen or whatever it may be, how do you maintain that space so you can open yourself up to that curiosity so you can look to establish that connection?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. I mean, there's some basic values that I think I hold inside of myself that I'd say there's probably like 7 that are primary that I try to work with. I try to have a sense of like that there is like spirit, that there's something greater than myself, right? Like Aristotle's de anima, or like I think that there's something more of me than just sinew and bones. And so I think that I could extend that to someone else also. There's something more inside of them. And I think another tenet that I try to hold is one of compassion, both compassion with myself and the other. Like, I mean, the way that looks with myself is I have my perfectionist tendencies, like probably borderline OCD at times, like not like clinical, but just like, okay, I have things that I want to have done, but having compassion with myself, like, okay, I make a mistake, like that's fine. Like I got to learn from that and move on. And I think that also helps me open up that same space for someone else, like in extending some compassion with them. Again, like leadership, like I think that's a quality like I hold inside of myself, like that, like I'm confident that I do know how to lead, but that my leadership is not always the way that it has to be, right? And I think that's probably one of the critical ones, is like my understanding of the world isn't necessarily the only way to understand the world. And I mean, even with someone that I would have a lot in common with, that I could be like, oh yeah, like that's my brother or that's my sister. Like that person could have a very stark different way of seeing something, and you're never really going to know unless you like open that up. I think integrity, right? Like the person that I purport to be, I have to make sure that I am in alignment with that person. So like sometimes that's hard, right? Like I think that
Yeah, it is.
we all have this very strong tendency to want to lie, not only to the other, but to ourselves, right? Because sometimes it's just easier, right? You're just like, oh my gosh, like I could get into a truly authentic conversation with someone right now. You know, it's something as simple as like, hey, how you doing? I'm fine, right?
Yeah.
Like someone's not really gonna want to bridge deeper than that. Like I remember like a friend of mine was from Australia when I was living in Belgium, and he was like, he would always ask, how you going? And I was like, oh, I was like, why the difference? Like from versus like, you know, the US is like, how are you doing versus how you going? And his name was Andrew. Andrew was always like, yeah, you know, like going is much more like, I want to know where you're at on your journey right now and who you are in the moment of like where you're at, like in this place. Whereas like whenever I hear Americans say, how are you doing? Like it just, it seems like it's very like, what are you doing? What are the actions that you're doing right now? Whereas like it was much more how are you going or how are you being was much more of a state of like your entire personhood. I think one of the other values I try to hold is like accountability. Like I try to hold myself accountable to like the things that I really like hold dear. And then, you know, try to open that up where if someone tells me who they want to be, like then we enter into this kind of almost like relationship where it's like, okay, I'm going to help you be the person that you want to be also. You know, and like, this is an element of myself that I have to be honest with. Like, I'm very competitive. Like I'm a competitive person. And I think, you know, a lot of people are, but it's not something that they'll acknowledge. But I think if like, in terms of holding true to myself, like I have to be like, okay, like I'm a competitive person. And the way that and it kind of seems like we might have strayed off, but to answer your question, how do I hold that space? Like, I have to be like, okay, I'm a competitive person and I'm going to enter into this relationship with this person. I have to put my competitive nature in check and be like, okay, like I'm not in competition with this person. I don't have to overcome them. I need to be like, okay, the competitive part of me is there. That's fine, but that's not where we're at right now. Like, this is more about dialogue. This is more about like trying to understand. So it's having like an understanding of like where those convictions for myself are, and like when they need to be engaged and when they don't need to be engaged. So I think that's how I've kind of maintained that space. And probably humility also. Like, there's a lot of times like
I already wrote
I
that
think
down.
I gotta check myself, because I really think I have a good idea, or like, oh, this is the way that something should be going, or, oh, I really want to say this right now. And there's a lot of times I'd be like, I gotta just bite my tongue and listen. And I think that listening is probably a good way to kind of land on a conclusion of like, that's the space, is to be way more open to listening than to like speaking.
There's so many directions.
I got
I got like 19.
Listen, this is the most notes I've taken in weeks.
So what I figured this conversation was going to be was like a masterclass on like leadership, and like basically we're just going to plug it into our consulting practice. So we'll just send you a royalty check. Nice. Man, so much in there. So let's go back. One of the first things that I was curious about was the compassion for self, and I think it kind of ties into maybe competitive nature and maybe another tenet for you. What does that sound like in your head? Like, how do you, okay, I'm going to put out what I'm trying to say and then I'll let you take it. Yeah. What's your self-talk like, and has it always been that way? And then how have you understood your competitive nature throughout? Like, have you always been competitive? Is that one of the earliest things you know about yourself, or is that learned? And then how do those things interact? It's a weird, I'm trying to get to a concept, but I can't form a smart question.
Yeah, I think I kind of see where you're going. Like, so the self-talk, like, no, like my self-talk has not always been there. Like, I think that's probably one of the things that I've grown the most in. Like, I don't think I was conscious of my self-talk probably till like second year of the Navy. Like, that screaming idiot that was in the back of my head, like, was unrealized. And I think I started realizing it was there, like, when I was in the military. But I don't think fast forward all the way through college. Like, I think that it was something that, like, I thought I had a good sense of, like, conscience, or, other, like, like having that sense that God is like somehow speaking or something like that. So that side of self-talk. But I think like the side where like I realized like, okay, like I can't ascribe the conversation going on inside of myself to that other. This is a conversation that I'm having with myself. And like what is that, and what has informed that? I don't think I became conscious of that probably till I was like 30. And I had a really smart life coach that kind of like unpackaged that for me, pulled it out. And
so but prior to that, was there a little bit of conflation between the two, the conversation with other, God, spirit? Like, what, like, was there some conflation there, or just a not realization of it, period?
I think that they kind of interwove for me a lot. And I wasn't like, it would be easy to ascribe. And I think, kind of speaks to this place where a lot of the current climate is at, right? Like, people have very strong, like, religious tenets about like, okay, this is God telling me to do this.
Right.
Right. And so, but sometimes that could be the summation of all of the things that are going on inside of your life. And that's just literally you talking to yourself. Like, not saying that like the holy or the divine isn't like, working through that also, but sometimes it's just yourself.
Right.
And you got to do the hard work of discerning like what's me and what is like that other mysteriousness that's like coming in that like I can't really explain why that is coming inside of me at this point. So I would say I'm still trying to figure that out at times. I've spent a lot more time trying to figure out like what is me and how to unpackage, like, do I want that as part of the self-talk that's going inside of my mind? So to make this a little more tangible of a conversation rather than a little more esoteric, like one of these life coaches really helped me unpackage like what I thought about like what love is.
Mm.
And I think that this is something that a lot of people go through their lives and they never really think about it, right? Like you've kind of grown up with a set of experiences from the time that, you're a little baby like Ruby and, like Sage and O, and you're loved, you're cared for, and you kind of have this concept of what it is to be loved and cared for.
Yeah, it's kind of assumed that we all think the same thing about it.
Yeah, correct. We think we've got this, but then, some people, that loved and cared for environment is harmed, right? Like I think what is the common term right now is trauma. Like, and that doesn't mean it's like a violent trauma or something like that, but there's something that's taking you out of
trauma
that.
and little T trauma.
Yeah. It's taking you out of that space. And so then unreflected, your idea of what love is continues forward, but it's different, right? Because of like little T trauma or something like that. And a lot of us go through in life and like we seek a partner or we seek a friend, or just significant relationships that are fulfilling that idea of like, okay, I'm loved and cared for, so I'm going to go find that in someone else. And it was this guy that I was talking with. He was like, you need to think about for yourself, what does love mean and how did that produce? And so we did some hard work, like thinking back in terms of like, how my parents cared for me, like some of my first relationships. And he was in some little T trauma in the background and maybe some big T trauma, depending on how you wanted to find it. And he's like, okay, so now so now he goes, you need to set up like a safe place for yourself. And so his definition of love is the mutual exploration of a shared safe space. And so if you do this hard work and kind of understanding like, okay, this is the idea of love that I'm looking for. And this is why I got into this relationship. Like, why am I in this abusive relationship? Like, okay, when I was really young, that's kind of where I was at or something like that. Because like, I always had to earn love or something like that. Like, like maybe, my mom or something like that, or my dad in this relationship. And I was only cared for if I did this. And so there was a contingent statement in terms of this. And what he said, like, love in its purest form is like, it's non-contingent. Like it's unconditional. Like that's what most people are looking for, is that unconditional love and care. But at some point in time, something has happened where we put a condition.
Stuff gets added in terms of like, okay, like in order for me to be loved, I have to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
And so most people will continue to seek that out, like, and so that's where codependence and a lot of like neuroses come from. And so
worthiness, deserve, like those things kind of get packaged in there somehow.
Yeah. So like that space of like self-talk, like, I'd say like the reason it didn't come through is to his 30s, because I was having those kind of conversations as, when I was in this space of like trying to figure out, okay, who am I? And like, where am I moving? And so I was unpackaging like some of these like deep things that are inside of my person and being like, okay, do I want that to remain a part of me? Look, it's still there. It's still a conversation in the back of my head, but I'm like, you know what? That's not going to inform who I am. I'm going to be way more like compassionate with that little version of me, like that little kid that's still inside of me that's seeking out that. And when that person comes out and is like, oh, I'm really needy right now, like I really need this person to pay attention to me, it's like, okay, look, maybe that person doesn't really want to pay attention to me right now, and that's okay. Oh, yep, look, that's my needy little child coming out, and like I'm gonna be compassionate with myself and be like, yeah, it's fine, like it's great, like let's sit down and have a conversation with that guy right now. Look, little Josh, like that person doesn't not
little J.
Yeah, they're not going to give you your attention right now.
Yeah.
And so I'd say that's been something that's been revelatory for me.
That's a journey I'm on actively right now. It's like discerning the voices in my head. How did that? I love how you made that real. And I'm sure we lost Keith. That's strange.
Oh, that's weird. Keith, you still there? There he is.
Keith.
Yeah.
You're back.
What happened?
I don't know. You dropped.
No, you dropped on our side. That was weird.
Yeah, and you dropped on my side. It's frozen a couple of times for a second or two.
Really?
But it hasn't been so.
Yeah, you dropped from
OBS Ninja, so I just had to go over and start recording again. That was strange.
Not right now, kiddo. Okay. Let's make
We're
it's
still
recording.
recording on our side.
Let's make
How much
sure.
did we lose?
We didn't lose any of ours. I think we just lost his feed
Yeah.
for a minute,
Hmm.
which is
I have like 425 questions.
how much of that last part did you hear? Because Keith, I was thinking about you the whole time.
I got to the self-talk, and you know, I think I didn't lose much, if any, at all.
So I want to ask a quick question, and I know you. This is actually a question kind of for you, but I want to. So you made that really real with the example on love. What'd you say, Keith?
To just kind of like make it a smooth transition into.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to what I was saying when I realized you were gone, so that we can.
Yeah.
So you gave us a really tangible example there, like the exploration of love for you. How did, as much as you want to share, how did that affect how you give and receive love?
Oh yeah, like I would say dramatically. Like prior to doing some of that hard work and understanding what I was seeking in life,
Mm-hmm.
I would say like I sought out relationships that were unreflected, you know? So like I was present, but I would say that, you know, like I didn't really understand why I was seeking certain relationships, but I would come back and I'd be like, man, like I don't really feel like I kind of feel bad about myself, like in the relationship, and I couldn't understand why. Post like doing some of these hard work with myself and like understanding who I was a little bit more, like I have found like, you know, way more comfortability in making the statement. I say this to Amy all the time, like probably the basis of she and I's relationship is I love you and you're wonderful, period. Right. And it's like, there's no conditions. It's just like always with wherever we're at, I love you and you're wonderful. Whereas I like that, I wasn't ever really able to be at that place before. It was like, yeah, I love you. But you know, what about this? Or
you need
like,
to work on a few things.
Yeah. Right. But what about me? Right.
Yeah.
And so I'd say like way more now, like I'm comfortable and I'm very comfortable sitting in a space of, man, I love you and you're wonderful. And like, let's figure out who we are. And so because I know more of who I am,
As I say, do you feel the same about yourself?
there's still parts of myself I don't like, right? Like
Sure.
very, very much.
Sure.
Like, and I probably don't give myself enough grace, like in certain areas. Like that's a perfectionist tendency of like, I'm going to rake myself over the coals about this. But I've gotten a lot better and be like, okay, look, it's not a failure. Like I'm learning, right? Like it's like I continue to, you know, have to take my foot out of my mouth. It seems like once or twice a week.
Well, I mean, it's there. God,
I know.
I'm
so
bringing
much.
like I'm on this journey of love. Rodney is well aware of it, and you said there's this component that kind of weaves my initial question together to something that you said at the beginning, and I want to get to a question. There is this space that we hold to wonder if that's me or if that's the energy or God or spirit that's traveling through me. And I conflate my ego with my essence or the spiritual attachment that I have to the existence that I live in this world, whatever that is. I'm a big fan of Eckhart Tolle and I'm, you know, just the power of now. And Rodney, I'm reading it again, and it has a whole different meaning to me this year than it did last year. That's a conversation maybe for another time. And I think about that separation, and you've gone through really trying to unpack it as I see that. Like I feel everything you're saying because I feel that shift in me. Like my thoughts and my ideas are not necessarily me. I am me. And whatever energy passes through me that I experience that makes me feel a certain way about doing something is an expression of who I truly am, not the ideas and thoughts that I have, right? And then when we bundle that together, all of a sudden my ego becomes my essence, and then you're totally screwed, right? Unless you do a lot of work. and you said ego at the beginning, and this before we, in the activation question section. How is it? So two things. How do you see your own ego? And what practice do you or practices do you put in place to unpack this since you figured, since you were 30? Do you have a consistent practice? Do you meditate? Like, what does that look like for you so ego doesn't take hold and cause you to not be you, but think you are?
Yeah. So for me, my ego is that, like, it's that part of me that strives to always be in the limelight, right? Like that combination of like the 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 elements that is truly me, or that my inner self says like, this is me. And it's the ego is like, hey, here it is out here in the world, and it constantly wants to put that in front of people and be like, look at me, look up here, look up here. It's like, it's this constant screaming idiot that's in the background that sometimes it has really intelligent things to say, and sometimes just like, oh my gosh, like, no. So for me, like the practices that I've tried to put in place every morning, I've got probably like 4 or 5 little meditation books that I keep on the side of our table. And, sometimes to the chagrin of my wife, Amy, like in the mornings, like I get up, like I make a little bit of breakfast, I make some coffee. And then for me, like I get into this space of reading like these sort of like meditations. And, she kind of pokes at me every once in a while. She's like, you're really good for reading in the morning. So I've tried to be better about, okay, like let's step out of that, right? Because then again, there's the ego thing, like, okay, this is how I'm going to get my day started. And she's like, look, we got to get shoes on the kids, like we got to get them ready for school, like let's go. So I've actually started to realize like, okay, I need to step out of like what is my practice of checking my own ego, and realize there's other things going on, like again, the others coming in and taking me out of like my space. And it's like, okay, I got to pay attention to that. So I'd say like my physical practice is like sitting down, doing some reading, but then being open to the other coming inside of like even that space. So, like I would say that is probably the best thing that I do. And then, gosh, like I used to run a lot more than I do now. I still run quite a bit, but, running I think is almost a spiritual practice, for me. And even like when I rowing for me was that escape out of the other. Because there's, they talk about those flow states, or those moments when you're just like outside of self, you're outside of those things. For me, like a physical practice, doing something, could be yoga, could be running, rowing, insert exercise here. Like when you're able to quiet that, voice that is that screaming idiot that's in the back of your head, and you're open to more of what's going on, then all of a sudden, like, that stream of consciousness, that thing that's just coming through, where there's like tons of information, that's coming through all the time. And all of a sudden there's a little bit clarity. I think I remember once saying like the human eye takes in like 10,000 points of information like a second or something like that. And I can't remember, like, don't quote me on the number, but it was ridiculous, like the amount of information that the human eye takes in. So this is going into your ocular, and like what actually is able to get received, it's like maybe like 5,000, something like that. It was a ridiculous number high. Could be hundreds. But like if we really put our attention on something, like vision wise, physical vision, we might be able to take in 3. But there's all of this information that's coming in that your brain is processing at some point in time. And for me, like that's like this ego, like engagement with the world. Like you're taking in all this information, and like it's all coming into your stream of consciousness. But you're getting this practice of like, okay, like what am I going to put my attention on? Like what am I really going to focus with? And so like those meditation journals, or like even, and then a physical practice for me is like, okay, what's going to take my attention now? And that kind of pulls me into those spaces.
How do you
real
go ahead, Keith.
like that?
Yeah, go.
That space, that flow state. I just was reading this morning in The Power of Now, And Eckhart Tolle refers, like, it's often referred to as an out-of-body experience, as he would say, it is like the true expression of self. Like, that is your essence. When everything is shut down and you are just with you, and you are here, and you're in your body, and you feel the burn, and you feel everything around you. I strive to get that, right? And work hard to be in that space often. And I think I'll close off in the beginning. This is the ultimate tension that exists in the world, is that not enough people try hard enough to just be. They're trying hard to make everybody else like them.
I think that's accurate, right? Like there's not a great deal of striving to be authentic and to be authentically human, right?
Mhm.
Like I think, okay, so there's some contingent statements, right? If you believe that we're created, right? Like that there's a created element to us versus just like, okay, a smashing together of like, you know, primordial mud that came together like millions of years ago, and we've been, you know, developing, which I think is accurate, right? Like I can't deny science. There's been some evolution that's come through there, but there's an element, right, that kind of came into it. So if you give that there's something that's more, right, then really, okay, so what is our purpose that's here? Like, you know, everybody defines purpose for themselves in some way. Like we all have this like great luxury right now of being able to say like, okay, what's my purpose? What am I going to fulfill? But I think foundationally, like figuring out who we're supposed to be as humans is like a foundational element. Like all of us should have this purpose of how do I be an authentic human? And I think that question, if to speak to what you were saying, Keith, like if more people would like delve into that question, we'd have some really fun conversations. And I think there'd be a lot less like animosity with people, because people would be like, oh my gosh, like I really don't know. And it would be a much more open space of like, okay, how do we answer this? Like how do we
talk about love, like that
yeah
that energy that we could commonly share to experience each other in a way, like it would just that
Hell, the
it would
shared
be
struggle of trying to be human
Yeah.
and trying to figure out self and
not trying to
like
hide it or fight it, which I want to come back to something, but Rodney has a question.
no, I like this train of thought. I mean, this idea of making trying to I don't know, like force humanity or what I think is right on everybody else when I haven't really figured out myself, or I haven't really like myself, not figured out the truth for myself, but just figured out even myself and then tried to parse the truth within that. I mean, I know when I hear myself talk, I hear my parents, I hear my coaches, I hear my grandparents, I hear
right
God, you know, what like you said, it all kind of mixes in and out. And then the super assured past me was like, you got to do this. And it's like, yeah, really? Do they? I don't know.
And there's this, like, when you reach in those moments, there's this calm that no matter what others do, say, or project on you, it does not matter. It's like, okay, thank you, right? Like there's an appreciation of your existence, going back to that holding space for other people. And it's so hard to maintain. Like I'm just at the beginning of really seeing this. And with the election going on and everything, all I can find my ego doing is be like, why don't you think this way? And and at the same time fighting with myself to say, yeah, but you know, this is the nature of the human struggle, and there's so much in it, and accepting it. But this ultimately leads to something I really want to understand from you is you talk about a value, and you are very reluctant to say that you're competitive. It's almost like I receive almost a sense of shame about it, or a guilt that it's like I shouldn't be competitive, but I am competitive. And like you talk about accepting that part of you, and like
on owning it. Yeah.
what what is that experience with competitiveness with inside of you? And am I even receiving it correctly? Like, am I hearing it, you know?
No, that's like very astute. I think that like your humanity meter is spot on. You know, so if we were talking about sport, right? Like I would have no problem being like, look, I'm competitive. Like, let's go out, let's sit on the rowing ergometer, let's race. Or if we're going to go to the gym and we're going to do like a CrossFit workout or something, like absolutely, I'm going to compete. I want to get into that. But I think what you're picking up on is, yeah, almost a shame. Like I don't want to be competitive to be a better human than someone else. Right? Like, because I don't think I have cornered the market on being a human being. And I wouldn't even say that my conception of how to be a good human is something that I would want to like put with someone else. Like I have some really good ideas, I think, at times. Like other times I think, well, you know, that didn't really happen. But to be competitive inside of this process of being authentically human, I think that's what you're picking up on. Is like, I don't want to compete with someone else to be better than they are. But absolutely, like to the core of me, I'm a competitive person. I think that's what's made me like a successful athlete. I think it's what's made me a successful coach. But in this process of being human, I don't think there's this space to compete against someone else in that, because we're all on a journey of figuring out, like you said, like you're just in this beginning place of finding out where I'm at with that. There's no reason that I need to compete with you on that. It's like, where are you at on your journey right now? Like, that's exciting, right? Like, that's a really fun conversation. And if you get into this element of like, oh, no, wait, Keith, I've got a really good idea about how you should be right now, right? Yeah. If I'm competing in that conversation to inform you who you're going to be, I've missed out. I've missed the connection. There's this really great Radiohead song, like where the gap in between, like the space between you and I,
the
space between. That's a great. There is an infinite distance between I and thou, right? Like you could slice it up however you wanted. Like I could sit right next to you, but there's still going to be some level of atoms that's between us.
Yeah.
And really the only way to cross this infinite distance is communication and dialogue and a genuine and authentic like reaching out. And in that authentic reaching out from me to you, I don't think there's a space to be competitive there. So I think that's the tension that you're picking up on, is like, it's this inner war, because I know I'm a competitive human being, like that my athlete self is constantly competing. But then when I drop into this space of like, okay, like now I'm, you know, thinking about who I am as a person, I want to get to know someone else, that animal side of me, that competitor comes out. And that's when I'm like, oh.
And potentially a third aspect, I don't know if this is for you, but I'm sensing this for myself now, hearing you. A third aspect is culturally, in politics, in company, we respect that competitor, and we respect that cocksure, that assured competitor who's like, I know.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of thinking back to your initial question, Keith, this tension right now with the election. I wonder if all this is kind of coming to a head where it's like, you know, you got the left and the right, and politicians are on the podium saying, this is the right way, this is the right way. And then they're saying, this is the right way, and this is the right way. It's like, I know I don't know any of this. How do you know? And maybe you do, maybe you don't. But like, there's this beating of like, I know and you don't know. And we're all just trying to be human, and nobody really has it. But in order to get where they are, and this isn't just politics, but like they've got to act like they know, or they've got to purport that they know. And we're all sitting back like, yeah, no, I don't. It doesn't feel right. Like there's layers of just discomfort with that system as it is, because it's not it. If you wanted to run for office and say what you just said, I'm a competitor, but I wrestle with that and I don't have this figured out. Like people be like, all right, well, you're not the guy. Like,
yeah, correct.
We need somebody who knows. When in my opinion, you'd be like, that'd be the perfect politician. Like we need somebody who's willing to sit down and question all this with people.
which I think brings up, like, that is an amazing pivot to the profession that you're in, and holding that conflicting space as a leader, trying to coach people, especially young people who don't even have, and this, no offense to your team, they're just scientifically don't have fully developed brains.
The brains
Like,
aren't there yet. Yeah.
they're more raw. They're more drawn to that stability and that leadership that we have assigned as leadership, as someone who just comes out and says it even if they're wrong. Like, how do you balance that as a leader and a coach?
Yeah, there's certainly times when, I'm at the front being like, okay, look at me. I know the way. This is where we're going. This is how it's going to go. And there's those times that you have to do that, right? Like, here's the training program. Here's who we're going to be. This is the foundation. Like, we talk a lot about Trojan rowing family at USC. And like, I have an idea of how we're going to create that, right? And so we move forward and it's there. But again, for me, it's that I try to weave that same conversation that we just had into my own coaching style. Like, there's times it's like, yep, this is the stroke. This is what the X's and O's of rowing, if you will. This is how we're going to row. This is what we need to do. But then there's other times where, okay, how are we going to get to that place? Or how are you, athlete ABC, going to get there? Their journey there is going to be different. And like, this is transformed over the last, 20 some odd years that I've been coaching. When I was a young coach, it was like, this is the way, make it happen.
My way or the highway.
My way or the highway. Like, this is how it's going to be. And what I realized is, like, I really ostracized a lot of really good athletes, and I probably lost some people. And so now, like, it's like, okay, this is what we're going to do. But even in the recruiting process, like, I'll tell athletes, like, hey, look, like, if you have a good idea, I want to hear it. Coaching is a dialogue. And so we talk about the center of our program being coaches and athletes, like, working together. And so we've got this little diagram that we have, that success is going to be the byproduct of us working on being the best version of ourselves. And so the best version of me is not going to be the best version that my athlete is going to be. Not my athlete, the athlete, or a athlete. Because they're not mine, right? Like, that possessiveness, I try to avoid that in my head, because I don't possess them. They are themselves.
It's like,
and yeah, correct, right? There's not an ownership that's there. But what I try to do is coach them to take ownership of themselves and of the process, and share with me how they are going to get to the place of fulfilling what we're trying to do. And so, it's definitely flipped in some programs, right? Where the center of the program is performance. It's like, look, you have to perform, or, there's the door, or there's the highway. And I would say that was like early version me. And there's still a lot of really successful programs where that's how they operate. But, I think we've chosen a harder path right now, where it's like the center of the program is going to be us trying to figure out this dynamic of how to become really good human beings. And there's a what we talk about is there's a freedom and autonomy that comes from that. So when I put them in a boat and I push them away from the dock, like, rowing's this weird sport, right? Where I don't get to make, like, substitutions in the middle. It's not like, oh, like 5 seat's not doing really good. Time out, like, let's put somebody else in. That doesn't work that way. It's like, when you get those people lined up in the boat and you send them away to race, like, they're on their own.
If somebody's off, they're off. Like,
yeah, they're off. Like, it's on to them to figure it out. You maybe train up your coxswain. It's like, okay, if this happens, this happens. But, in an 8, you've got 9 bodies, 9 minds, 9 souls that are trying to weave themselves together to get from point A to point B in the fastest possible way. And sure, if it's like, hey, it's this way, do this, execute the plan, there's no freedom. There's no autonomy. The coxswain goes out, okay, coach gave us the race plan. This is how it's going to go. If something goes wrong, a lot of times that person's going to panic, because they're like, oh, like, it was supposed to be like this. And there's no, like, autonomy for them to be like, okay, this went wrong. What's next? And so what we try to do in this space of saying, like, okay, like, this is you and I working on becoming our best version of ourselves, is when I push you away and you go out, I'm like, I just want you to be yourself. Trust that, like, you have integrity, you have accountability, you're compassionate with yourself, everybody's leading, everybody's taking ownership, everybody's going to lead inside of that, everybody's taking responsibility for the rate of the boat or the split, everybody's tied together with this sense of spirit. So like whatever comes at you, I trust that you're going to make the adaptation. And there's a freedom and autonomy in that, knowing that no matter what happens on the race course, when they come back out, I'm going to be standing on the dock. My very first question is like, how'd we go? Like, how was the race? And if it was like, oh, fantastic. And it's like, oh, good. Like any place we can improve on. Yeah, we could do this and this. Great. When we go back to practice, we can work on those things. But if it's a bad race, they're going to come back and like, oh man, like we would, like it wasn't that great, and sometimes like even the races they win was not a good race for them. And they come back and it gives us something to work on. Sometimes like the best race, like we had this race once where we ended up, down by 0.3 of a second at the end of the race. Just one more stroke and we would have been fine. But they came back and they were like, that was the most in rhythm that we were so synced together. Like really, we probably could have sprinted a little bit earlier. That might've got us there, but like it was amazing. Right. And like, half the boat doesn't even remember it, speaking of that flow state, like that place that they're in, they're just in it in that moment. And so, I'd say like in terms of a coach, like there's times that I definitely have to stand in and say like, yes, this is where we're going to go. But there's also times I have to, be humble and be like, okay, like how are you guys thinking that we're going to get there? And if it's a good idea, man, there's been a lot of times, especially within the last like 4 or 5 years, that I've been like, you know what, I think that we should try this. And now all of a sudden, like that athlete feels empowered, right? And a lot of coaches shy away from wanting to empower their athletes because they're like, oh, well, what if they're going to try to take over the program or they're going to exert authority? But I'm just not really afraid of that, like, because ultimately they know that I'm the head coach,
right?
They know I'm in charge. But there's a space there for me to be able to say like, okay, you got a good idea, let's bring it in. And I have become a better coach, a better person because they've informed me. And so there's a shallow slope, right? Like there's definitely times where, I have to be at the head. I got to make decisions that they don't want to do. I got to give them workouts they don't want to do. Sure. Because, but
there's a physical aspect, like you got to do the work.
Yeah. It's way more of a horizontal leadership, like not strict horizontal where there's no, leader or anything like that. I tried that once. That didn't work out very well. But it's not like strict hierarchy, right? Like it's not.
You show up and just say, what are we going to do today? And they're like,
yeah. So like,
what do you you good? You need nap?
I think,
okay.
Something I never really thought about in the performance culture where it's just performance. I mean, there is, right. There's the whole being invited back aspect. Like if every season is losing, people are like, what are we doing here? So you may not get invited back. But then there's, if performance is the only measure of success, and what I just heard was you're going to miss maybe that question of how to go. Because like, just because we're winning doesn't mean we're doing all right, or that we feel good about it, or just because we lost doesn't mean that we didn't do something amazing that we could maybe figure out how to do better. So that seems like a small nuance, but maybe like really important.
I think it's an important nuance for sure, right? Like you have to have a space to improve, right? Does that kind of hit on it? Like you have to have this space where like we can always be improving.
Yeah.
And that sense of being invited back, if it's only performance, perform, then you start to treat the athletes as they're automatons, right? It's just like, okay, robot, like sit there, do this. And they get that sense. Like even if you're saying like, hey, I value you, but like perform.
Mm-hmm. So do you value me or the output?
Yeah, correct.
Like, which one is it?
Yeah.
It can't be both, or can it? I don't know.
I think the harder pathway in terms of creating a culture within a team is, and I would say that you could probably apply this even outside of an athletic team culture. I mean, I think there's applications to any environment. Culture is not really the right term. Like environment, I would probably say is better than culture. Like that environment is going to apply wherever. If you are like valuing your people that are there, you're opening up a space for them to contribute to that. You're going to have a way more dynamic situation where people are going to want to come back and they're going to want to do better because like, whoa, this person really values me. This person really thinks that I am contributing. And what I've found, especially like, in my own situation inside of athletics is like, if I if I can truly and authentically reach that athlete and let them know, like, look, you're unconditionally loved and cared for. But yes, I'm going to push you to the very limits of your human potential. They want to do that. They want to find that limit for themselves. You know, we talk about the scale of autonomy. Like, are you extrinsically motivated or are you intrinsically motivated? And neither one is good or bad. But along that pathway, you're actualized differently. Some people are super motivated by, you know, rewards and by medals, you know, and that's fine, right? Like, but, you know, I would say that you have less autonomy in that because, like, you're only seeking this. You know, you'll talk to Olympians that they get done and they're like, gosh, I spent 12 years working towards this medal and, like, now I got it. And it's like, okay, well, now what do I do? You know, I've even had conversations with people on the Olympic, like, I've been on the Olympic podium that are like, you know, if I had to do it all over again, I don't know if I do it.
Really?
Yeah. Like, and, you know, if they're going to be honest with themselves, like, I've people have said that. I think that's kind of sad, right?
Yeah.
Like, because, like, you invested, like, all these times within your life. And so it's got to be about something more than just the win or the chunk of metal, medal, that you're going to have.
There's this reality, and Rodney and I talk about a lot of things a lot, but the mentality of the process is not culturally instilled upon us. We are taught to revere the results, right? So when we engage in something, we engage for the result of it, not the process of it. And what I love about the approach that you take, when you can get someone into flow state, and for anybody who hasn't been in it in any way, there's a missing existence when you don't get a chance to be in it. If you can get in flow state, whether it's in practice or in the, are they meets? Is that
Yeah, we call them
regattas, or whatever it might be, and the result isn't what you wanted it to be, but that process, like, of excellence and achievement and improvement and betterment and in being in it, is ultimately the experience, and you get a result for it. That result becomes far more rewarding because you're so attached to the approach to getting there, rather than just thinking about the thing. And then you're not in the moment, you're not in the present, you're tapping into ego more than you are your existence, and then you get a result. And it's sad. I mean, it's unfortunate. It's like, oh, I'm here, now what?
Yeah,
right.
Correct. I think that's a very accurate descriptor.
It kind of makes me think of oh, sorry, go ahead, finish that, Keith.
I was just gonna say, or I could just go back and keep training, because that's what I love. And I might not be training for a medal again, but I never was in the first place. Like, I was and I wasn't, right? I have a goal, but that's right. Like, it's a weird fine balance. But sorry, go ahead, Roddy.
No, hearing you say, like, the sad part, it kind of makes me think of actors and actresses that make it, and really anybody on a famous, like, public stage who makes it, they feel hollow and empty, but everybody's like, oh, but you got the life, you got the money and the house, and you just made that movie, and you got that medal, but it's not fulfilling. Like, it's not
like billionaires who aren't happy.
The money, yeah, it's not enough to, but we champion it in our environment, and I'll say in our Western world. I think it's not just Western, and there's different versions of it elsewhere, but we champion it, and then we get there and it's hollow if we don't explore our humanity, if we don't know who we are, if we don't explore the full range of mind, body, spirit.
I had a coach friend of mine once ask me a question. He's like, how do you know when you've made it? And I thought it was a great question. And I was like, so I asked I was like, so I don't understand. Like, what do you mean? He's like, well, how do you know when you made it? Like, here we are, like, it was early on. He's like, we're struggling. We're trying to work ourselves to a point where, we're either going to be head coaches, or, we're going to transition into something else. Or, if we're in the business world, like, we're going to be a CEO, we're going to own our own company. Like, how do you know if you've made it? And I was like, oh man, like, that's so specific to the person, right? Like, in terms of where they are. because I think, from the outside looking in, like if someone were going to look at my life, they'd be like, oh, wow, like wife, kids, education, head coach of a, Power 5 institution, like guys made it. But from my reality, I'm like, I have not made it, because like I see that there's so much more that I could be doing.
Right.
Like not doing is not the right word. There's so much more that I have to learn about how to help people, how to help myself, like how to be a better leader. Like I would not say that I've made it. And I'd say that, there's all of these incumbent struggles that come like with having arrived at that place. It's just different. Whereas, from the outside looking in, we look at people, you look at actors or, people that are really famous and like, whoa, man, they've made it. But it's like, okay.
I've always been a fan of like kung fu movies and martial arts. And I think it's because the masters, the senseis, like these badass dudes and women that like, they can do things that are unreal. Right. And as they're talking to their pupil or their head pupil or whatever, and they're like, oh, but you're the master. Like, you got this. And they're like, no, I don't. They're like, and it's not even it's not a false humility. It's a very much like, no, I don't have this figured out. I just happen to be further ahead than you. I'm still searching, still seeking, still meditating, still practicing. And it's like this balance of just mastery and but I'm still going. Like it's
that outside perspective. Like we just met, Josh. I see your life. I see it as a point in time reference to my life, right? I don't see tomorrow or the next day, or so it's this outside perspective influence that we create when we don't go through the journey of self-discovery. And I think it's a human condition to compare and contrast, and we look at other people and go, oh, you did this, and it's like, oh, cool. I look at you, Josh, in this moment in time and say, you've done all this, but I don't know the last 20 years. It's like when you leave your parents' house who worked so long to get to this big house, and you leave and you're like, well, I have to have a big house too. It's like you didn't see every step along the journey. When we hit that point, like when we hit that alignment to ourselves to just be in it and just process it, like we can hit these achievements along the way, but like I know I'm going to keep going because I want to keep living.
Yeah.
So like living can't just be the one time you stand on the podium. Like living
Correct.
is far longer than that, right? But I have to, like, you share your thought, and I just want to call out, we have 2 minutes and one final question because this conversation has been,
it's gone so fast.
Yeah, it's going really fast.
So
there was a coach mentor of mine early on in my career, and he handed me like a 1-page sheet, and it's called the Zone of Discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a picture of 2 lines, like kind of like, parallel lines going off in the distance, perpendicular, like when you do that, like railroad tracks for perspective. And off in the far distance is this target. And off to the side, he'd had like little statements like, too far to the right, too far to the left, versus I spend all of my time with friends. I don't spend any time with friends. I spend all of my time in the library studying. I don't ever pick up a book, or I spend all my time in the weight room. I don't even pick up a weight. And I remember it's like, oh, this is pretty rudimentary. He's like, yeah, but like if you're going to present the opportunity for someone to drop into a flow condition, like it's going to happen in this place of discipline where you're not too far to the right, you're not too far to the left, but you're somewhere right in the middle, and you're kind of walking in that dynamic tension of those things. And, when you really like Csikszentmihalyi, who like kind of pioneered that sense of flow state, like, I think that's kind of what I took from him is like, you're constantly trying to present yourself with the opportunity to drop into that flow condition. And a lot of people are like, oh, I could never do the work. It's like, okay, you really could pick up a book that you're really interested in reading. And like, how many times have you been reading and like the time just flows away?
Yeah.
That's a flow state, right? You entered into the practice of reading words, and through that you quieted all of the stream of consciousness that's going through. And like, all of a sudden you were in a different space, and like, that's flow, right? Like, so I think a lot of people really have had an experience of flow, but haven't
know it.
Yeah. They haven't like gone through reflexively and
Right.
said like, okay, how did I present myself the opportunity for being inside of that?
So I'm taking out of this discovery, reflection, actualization. I think we've solved it.
Summed it up. Done.
Summed it up.
There we go.
All right. Man, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks
This is
for coming
wonderful.
through. I mean, we're gonna have to do more of this online and offline. Like, this is fun.
Yeah. This
is a great conversation, by the way. Like, this time goes by.
Oh, it goes right by, and it's just like, this is a space I want to be in. This is a space I want to be in prior to an election too. Like, this gives me hope, and it just helps me focus on the things that I can control and things like, man, I can reflect on me a lot more than other people and what's going wrong right now. Because I think that's the suck too.
Yeah.
There's this vacuum of like, the world's on fire because it's on fire, and then it's like, oh wait, but I can control what I can control. So
right.
Thank you.
So we got a final question we ask everybody.
Okay.
This is now your audience. They've hung around this long. What do you want to leave them with? What do you want them to ponder or take away?
Being authentically human is not as hard as it may seem. It really starts with asking yourself some pretty simple questions, right? What motivates me? Like, okay, like maybe that's, achievement of medals. Maybe that's achievement of like superiority in work. Maybe that's like having a nice house, whatever it is. Okay, ask yourself, okay, why is that motivating me? And is that going to truly fulfill who I am? What does it mean for me to be fulfilled? And I think also like really trying to delve into like the interior conversation that's there. Being authentically human starts with figuring out who is having the conversation inside of your head, right? That reflexive conversation, like, oh, that's my, third grade softball coach that told me I could never hit a ball. Like, that's that person that's there. Like, all of this with a little bit of reflective time can unpackage some of the dialogue that's going on inside of our heads. And that'll put you on a step of this process, right? Of like learning more about you. So being authentic is something I think that, if you've made it this far in the conversation, like continue the journey, like keep asking yourself those questions.